I turn your attention to Psalm 105 today. We're going to be reading somewhat considerably from this psalm today, and if you have opportunity to open up your Bible and follow along, I would appreciate that. I think that'll help you along a little bit. The psalm begins in verse number 1, "Give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, proclaim his deeds among the peoples. Sing to him, sing praise to him, tell about all his wondrous works, honor his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Seek the Lord in his strength. Seek his face always. Remember the wondrous works he has done, his wonders, and the judgment he has pronounced. You servant, you offspring of Abraham, his servant, Jacob's descendants, his chosen ones." We're going to look at this psalm and how this breaks down the history of the people of God. I wanted to start by reading these first few verses to emphasize a couple of introductory points. One, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this, when you read the Old Testament and you read things about Israel, about Jacob, about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, about the people of God in general, with very few, if any, exceptions, those comments that are given, even the literal history of the nation, has spiritual implications for the people of God today. We read in Paul's letters, especially in Galatians and in Romans, that we are the inheritors of these promises in very large degree, not in the same way exactly as Moses and his contemporaries or Isaiah and his contemporaries or others that we might talk about, the literal nation of Israel, the literal descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's not us exactly, but the spiritual implications of this nation, going all the way back to the promise to Abraham, that in him all the nations of the earth were going to be blessed. In his seed, all the nations would be blessed. That is us. And Paul makes the very clear point that the true inheritors of Abraham's promises, the true children of Abraham, the spiritual children, these are the ones who share in his faith rather than share specifically in his DNA. And that's one of the reasons why we turn to the Old Testament, one of the reasons why we learn these lessons given to us in the Old Testament. This is why we read about singing praise to him, seeking his face always, and remembering the wondrous works that he has done, especially that in the context here today, remembering his wondrous works. We obviously did not exist back in the days of Abraham, the days of Moses, and the days of Joshua. But we can remember what God has done for his people, regardless of what form his people might take in any given dispensation. And we can draw strength from that. And not just strength. And I'm going to spoil the ending for you here a little bit and skip ahead to the very last verse of the psalm. Psalm 105, verse 45 reads, "All this happened so that they might keep his statutes and obey his instructions." Hallelujah. That's how the CSB reads in Psalm 105. And we're going to go through this text a little bit here today and emphasize how God acted with his people in times past. And it's all about obedience. It's all about setting them up for obedience. And I think you're going to find that the nation goes through stages of development, much like a child would go through stages of development. Early stages, middle stages, later stages, different things are expected of the people of God at different stages. But throughout it all, God gives them what he gives them for good and for ill, positive and negative, all to encourage obedience, all to build faith in the one who has given them all of these things. And so that's what we want to talk about here today. And we're going to kind of walk through this a little bit. First of all, looking at the land of Canaan, before it was really even a nation. Verse number 7 reads, "He is the Lord our God. His judgments govern the whole earth. He remembers his covenant," that is the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "He remembers his covenant forever, the promise he ordained for 1,000 generations. The covenant he made with Abraham, swore to Isaac, and confirmed to Jacob as a decree and to Israel as a permanent covenant. I will give the land of Canaan to you as your inherited portion." This is part of that promise. He was going to give them the land of Canaan. "When they were few in number," verse 12 reads, "very few indeed, and resident aliens in Canaan, wandering from nation to nation and from one kingdom to another, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their behalf. Do not touch my anointed ones or harm my prophets." We're going to see later on in the history of Israel that God permitted bad things and even to a certain degree encouraged bad things to happen to his people for a variety of purposes. But that is not appropriate in the rearing of an infant. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about an infant nation, when it really isn't a nation at all. It's barely even a family. When Abraham, and most of the story is given to the story of Abraham, and much of that, Abraham doesn't even have a child to call his own, to carry on these promises. The covenant that was very real was absolutely speculative in Abraham's eyes. It was real in God's eyes, of course, but Abraham didn't see any of it. And clearly it was important that God protect Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in these early stages. And so it's appropriate then when Abraham wanders into a foreign land, or Isaac or Jacob, and they meet with difficulties. God's level of protection is considerably higher, because he is dealing with a nation that has not yet come into being yet. Much like an infant child needs to be protected much more than a toddler or a teenager or a grown adult child. This is what God is doing for the people before they are even a people. These promises that are given, and they're reiterated in the Old Testament numerous times. I'm going to refer you, for instance, to Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse number 11. This commandment that I give today is certainly not too difficult, and we'll come back to that word commandment in a second, by the way. It's certainly not too difficult or beyond your reach. It is not in heaven, so that you have to ask who will go up to heaven, get it for us, and proclaim it to us. And proclaim it to us that we may follow it. And it is not across the sea, so that you have to ask who will cross the sea, get it for us, and proclaim it to us, so that we may follow it. But the message is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, so that you may follow it. See, today I have set before you life and prosperity, death and adversity. For I am commanding you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his statutes, his commandments, statutes, and ordinances, so that you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God may bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away, and you do not listen, and you are led astray to bow in worship to other gods and serve them, I tell you today that you will certainly perish, and that you will not prolong your days in the land that you are entering to possess across the Jordan. I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you today, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, so that you and your descendants may live. Love the Lord your God, obey him, and remain faithful to him. For he is your life, and he will prolong your days as you live in the land the Lord swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's reading through the end of the chapter in Deuteronomy chapter 30, starting verse 11. These promises are given to the people of God so that they will prosper. And here we are in Deuteronomy on the verge of the first real fulfillment of those prophecies. And Moses reminds them that you have been sheltered all of this way. You have been protected from the very beginning so that you would be in position to obey, so that you would be in position to distinguish yourself from all of these pagan nations. They were kept separate. Even going into Egypt itself was a way for God to separate them from their neighbors and keep them close, keep them individualistic, keep them separated from the rest. This is what God has always intended for his people. And such is the case even today, that we are separated. We are the peculiar people. I think the old King James Version has in 1 Peter chapter 2. I kind of like the terminology there. You are a chosen race. You are a people for God's own possession, different from everybody else. And such has been the case from the very beginning. And we need to preserve and even increase that separation, not in a moralistic high horse kind of way, but to acknowledge that God treats his people differently than he treats everybody else. That is not an opportunity, though, for us to vaunt ourselves, to act like we are more important, that we are superior, that we are inherently better than anybody else. It should be an opportunity for us to praise, as we just read from the first part of Psalm 105, and particularly in this context, an opportunity to obey. If God has done all of these things for us, if he has made these great and precious promises to us that the New Testament talks about, then why would we not live our lives in his service in an obedient, submissive way? This should be our obsession while we wait here on earth, not just what we have to do. It should be what we want to do. Now, if you continue in the story, it gets a little bit more spectacular than that. We go back to Psalm 105 and read in verse number 16, he, that is God, called down famine against the land and destroyed the entire food supply. He had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They hurt his feet with shackles. His neck was put in an iron collar until the time his prediction came true. The word of the Lord tested him. The king sent for him and released him. The ruler of the people set him free. He made him master of his household, ruler over all his possessions, binding his officials at will and instructing his elders. We know the Joseph story there. This is the first bit of the people going into Egypt. Joseph is there first. He makes a place for himself. Then Israel, that is the entire nation, and the man himself, Israel, went into Egypt. Jacob lived as an alien in the land of Ham. The Lord made his people very fruitful. He made him more numerous than his foes, whose heart he turned to hate his people and to deal deceptively with his servants. He sent Moses, his servant, and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They performed his miraculous signs among them and wonders in the land of Ham. We'll come back to that in a second, trust me. He sent darkness, and it became dark, for did they not defy his commands? He turned their water into blood and caused their fish to die. Their land was overrun with frogs, even in their royal chambers. He spoke, and insects came, gnats throughout the country. He gave them hail for rain and the lightning throughout their land. He struck the vines and fig trees and shattered the trees of their territory. He spoke, and locusts came, young locusts without number. They devoured all the vegetation in their land and consumed the produce of their land. He struck all their firstborn in the land, all their first progeny. Then he brought Israel out with silver and gold, and no one among his tribes stumbled. Egypt was glad when they left, for the dread of Israel had fallen on them. He spread a cloud as covering and gave a fire to light up the night. They asked, and he brought quail and satisfied them with bread from heaven. We'll come back to that in a second. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves. While the people were in what's called the land of Ham, which is Egypt, God was protecting them. God was guiding them, and he did amazing things. Most of the 10 plagues are mentioned here. And in case you're wondering, the land of Ham, that is a reference back to Genesis chapter 10, where the descendants of Noah's family are mentioned there. In Genesis chapter 9, skipping down to verse number 13, we'll look at verse number 4. That would be better. Ham's sons. Ham is the son of Noah, of course, coming off the ark. Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan, the text says there. And Mizraim wound up fathering in verse number 13 the people of Lud, Anam, Lehab, Naphtuah, Pathros, Kasla, and Kaphtor. Now, what this is basically saying is it's lining out the history of these ancient nations. And Ham is the ancestor of Cush, who is associated traditionally with Central and Southern African tribes. He's the father of Put, which is Northern African tribes, and also Mizraim. And I skipped over one. Apologies. The other one was... said Put and Cush and Mizraim and Canaan, of course. Canaan is the ancestor of the Canaanite tribes, the ones that are in the land of Canaan. That's where they get the name. But Mizraim is associated very strongly with the nation of Egypt. And so when we see the land of Ham, this is not just an association with the flood, but also an emphasis that the people of God who are Semitic, they come from the family of Shem. The people of God are distinct. They are very distinct at their very core. They started separating from the land of Ham almost as quickly as they possibly could. And there may be a touch of the curse of Ham in here also. Remember, Ham was inappropriate toward his father in these early days and received a curse, especially on his son Canaan. But there is a connection here. Egypt is the bad guys, is what he's basically trying to say. I find it hilarious for some weird reason that the nation of Israel, which is known so prominently for its dietary laws, originated in the land of Ham. I think that's funny, but be that as it may. These wonders, these amazing things that were done for the people of God in these times were to put them in position to obey, put them in position to distinguish themselves from the people of the nations. Again, going back to where we left off in Psalm 105, and verse number 39, he spread a cloud as a covering and gave a fire to light up the night. They asked, and he brought quail and satisfied them with bread from heaven. He opened a rock, and water gushed out. It flowed like a stream in the desert, for he remembered his holy promise to Abraham his servant. He brought his people out with rejoicing, his chosen ones with shouts of joy. He gave them the lands of the nations, and they inherited what other peoples had worked for. This is what the people were able to do because God blessed them, because God was with them. Moses recounts this in Deuteronomy chapter 8, in the first few verses, how they were protected, remarkably protected in the wilderness. He writes for us here in Deuteronomy 8, verse 1, carefully follow every command I am giving you today so that you may live and increase and may enter and take possession of the land the Lord swore to your fathers. Remember that the Lord your God led you on the entire journey, these 40 years in the wilderness, so that he might humble you and test you to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. Again, that word commands, it keeps coming back to that. He humbled you by letting you go hungry. Then he gave you manna to eat, which you and your fathers had not known, so that you might learn that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out, and your feet did not swell these 40 years. Keep that in mind, that the Lord your God has been disciplining you just as a man disciplines his son. So keep the commandments of the Lord. Keeping the commands of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and fearing him. Again, we keep coming back to this idea of commandments, and it looks somewhat different in our families as it does in the family of God as things progress. Certainly Abraham went through his trials, as did Isaac and Jacob, but there was never any question that the people were going to survive. It was always God's plan. God was sheltering them tremendously. And then when they go into Egypt, it's a larger nation and more trying. And Exodus chapter 12 and verse number 24 through 48, we skipped over that and we intended to touch on that. When the Passover went over, the people of God were required to obey in painting the doorposts with the blood of the Passover lamb. They were going to die. The text does not say anything about the people of God dying in this moment. I suspect it's because they all obeyed. That was the point. They were distinguished from the people of Egypt because they were willing to obey. One relatively easy command, but it saved their life. And this is how God works with us as we develop in our faith. He asks little things of us, and then he asks a little more, and then he asks a great deal more. And as we grow in our faith, we get more and more adept at his service, at compliance to his will. This is what shows us to be worthy people of God. Not worthy in the sense that we have earned our salvation somehow. We are recipients of grace, and such was the case, by the way, long before Jesus died on the cross, at least historically speaking. The very first person who received grace in the eyes of the Lord was Noah. The text says in Genesis chapter 6, God showed grace to Noah. Noah didn't deserve the ark. Noah got on the ark because he was a follower of God, and God showed him grace. This has always been how God deals with his people, how God deals with those who want to be in a proper relationship with him. But when he finds those people, he gives them commands. He gave Noah a command to build the ark. He gave Israel a command to paint the doorposts. He gave the people in the wilderness commands to follow where the cloud led them and the fire led them, and ultimately to go into the land of Canaan and take the land and conquer Jericho and all the rest of these battles that you see in the book of Joshua and other places. That's God's pattern. It has always been that way. And it is that way in the New Testament as well. When we as the people of God come to Jesus and we rejoice because we're saved by grace, and that's what Ephesians chapter 2 tells us and other places as well, that we are saved not just by our own works, but because God has chosen to save us. We were dead in our works. We died because of our trespasses and sins, and there was nothing we could do to work our way out of that. Paul's quite clear about that in the first 10 verses of Ephesians chapter 2. But oftentimes in our eagerness to emphasize how we're saved by grace and not by works, lest any man should boast, we leave off verse number 10, which says that we were created in him for good works, that God had ordained beforehand that we should walk in them. The reason that we are brought out of the world, the reason that we are saved in the first place, is so that we can act like Christians, so that we can do what God asks us to do. We as the body of Christ in the New Testament era should appreciate that more than most, because the body of Christ implies that we are representing Jesus here in the flesh. He once walked in the flesh. He no longer does so. Now we are his body. We are his flesh. And so it's incumbent upon us to live our lives in a way that Jesus did and the way that we should. This is why he brought us out of the world in the first place. And perhaps this is a rather long-winded way of saying how important it is that we live godly lives, that we listen to what God is telling us to do, and then we go out and do it as completely as we can. We never convince ourselves, or hopefully we don't convince ourselves, that we're perfect in this, that we somehow have earned our salvation, because that's absolutely not the case. But the whole point of being saved is so that we can act like we're saved, so that we can act like different kind of people than the world. We're not Egypt. We're not the Canaanites. We are the people of God. We are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are following after their legacy, living lives like their lives of faith, lives of hope, lives of confidence. Read Hebrews chapter 11. Look at all these people, including Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who did not fully understand, but they obeyed because they believed. And now we who are recipients of these end time things, those of us who have come to the end, at least in terms of physical things of the story, we see everything that God has ever had in mind for us here in the flesh. We see it in Jesus Christ. And how much more so should that motivate us to live lives of faith and hope and commitment and holiness and all of these great things that God talks about in the New Testament and the Old Testament as well. So when we read Psalm 105, it's not just a history lesson. It's not just a reminder. It's not just a review of what happened in Old Testament days. It's also an encouragement for the people of that day and encouragement for people today to remember who we are and what we are all about, what we're supposed to be all about, and reinforce in our minds the need that we have to live lives of obedience. So let's not get chafed somehow when God asks us to do something that ordinarily we would not do. That's the whole point of being the people of God. The people out there in the world do whatever they want to do. We are different than that. We are the peculiar people. We are the ones who are committed to righteousness and holiness and obedience. We eagerly await God's command so that we can show ourselves to be his people in keeping those commands. That includes baptism for remission of sins. It by no means stops there, though. It continues every aspect of our life, confessing Jesus every single day so that one day he will confess us in heaven. I hope this encourages you to read the Psalms more, to derive more from the Psalms, not just in a historical sense, not just in a poetic sense, but also seeing that they speak to us and help us understand what it means to be the people of God, especially the people of God in a wicked world. So I hope and pray that this has been a blessing to you. Please don't hesitate to share, to like, to subscribe, all of the above. Thank you for checking in today, and God bless.